In 1878, a board of United States Navy engineers ran a punishing series of tests on every metal shaper they could get their hands on. They were looking for the one machine reliable enough to build the fleet. When it was over, they didn't just pick a favorite. They declared a single machine the standard for the entire Navy, and it came from a two-story wooden building in a Connecticut mill town. 8 years earlier, that building had been a shed in a man's backyard, powered by a steam engine he built himself on winter nights when there was no other work. That building belonged to the Hendey Machine Company. Before we get into how a backyard shed became the standard of American precision, if you appreciate the stories like this one, subscribe to Trade Archive and give this video a like. Now let's go back to the beginning. Henry John Hendey was born in London in 1844, and around 1848 his family crossed the Atlantic and settled in Waterbury, Connecticut, deep in the brass country of the Naugatuck Valley. This was not a gentle place to grow up. It was a region of foundries and rolling mills, coal smoke and line shafts, where a working man's future was decided by the skill in his hands. Henry learned the hardest and most exacting trade of them all. He became a toolmaker and machinist, the kind of man other machinists came to when a job was too fine for anyone else. In 1865, at 21, he moved 17 miles north to a village called Wolcottville, a cluster of woolen mills and brass works along the Naugatuck River that would later become the city of Torrington. And Torrington had one advantage that shaped everything that followed. The railroad had reached it in 1849, connecting a once isolated mill town to New Haven, New York, and the markets of a country about to industrialize faster than the world had ever seen. Henry had a younger brother, Arthur, who worked as a pattern maker down in New Haven. A pattern maker carves the wooden masters that shape a casting in sand, and it is one of the most underrated skills in metalworking, because every casting a foundry pours begins as a piece of wood shaped by hand. Between the two of them, the Hendey brothers held both halves of the craft. Henry could machine metal to a hair. Arthur could shape the patterns those parts were cast from. In the summer of 1870, with the country still recovering from the Civil War and work uncertain, they bet on themselves. They founded a small custom machine shop and called it Hendey Brothers. They had almost nothing. Their first workspace was rented space inside another firm's shop in Wolcottville. They had no real capital, and here is the detail that tells you exactly what kind of men they were. They needed power to run their machinery, and they could not afford an engine. So Henry built one. In his spare hours, on long winter evenings before the shop even opened, he designed and constructed a small 3-horsepower rotary steam engine entirely by hand. That homemade engine drove their first work. And when the company had grown into an industrial campus decades later, that little engine was not scrapped. It was kept, set on a table in the engine room of the great plant, silent and idle, a relic of where it all began. The men who ran the largest precision tool works in New England walked past it every day. Their first real order was for 20 wood-turning lathes. It proved the market believed in their work, but it wasn't enough to keep 2 families fed. So Henry did what tradesmen have always done when a young business can't yet pay them. He kept his day job, working 12 hours a day at another shop for the top machinist's wage of the time, $5 a day, and he built his own company in whatever hours were left. Arthur ran the shop with a single hired assistant, while Henry chased a paycheck to keep the lights on. Their hard work paid off. By the spring of 1872, they had outgrown their rented corner and moved into a larger space known as the East Branch Spoon Shop. And in 1873, confident and growing, they made the leap every ambitious small business dreams of. They built their own factory, a 2-story wooden building, 40 feet by 60, on the very ground along Summer Street that would remain the company's home for the next 80 years. The timing could not have been worse. In September of 1873, the American economy collapsed. A major banking house failed, the market cratered, and the country fell into what people simply called the panic, a depression that ground on for years. The Hendeys had just taken on the debt of a brand new building at the exact moment credit vanished and customers stopped paying. Several of the men who had put money in got scared and wanted out. To survive it, in 1874 they reorganized into a joint stock company to raise working capital and spread the risk, and the business took the name it would carry into history. The Hendey Machine Company capitalized at $16,000. On paper, a fresh start. In reality, the two brothers were exhausted, and one of them was breaking. The strain fell heaviest on Arthur. Running a machine shop through a depression, working the long grinding hours it demanded while the debts loomed, wore his health down until he could no longer continue. In 1875, Arthur Hendey left. He went to the West Coast to try to recover, and he never returned to the daily life of the company he had helped found. Think about what that meant for Henry. He had already been moonlighting to fund his own shop. Now his partner, his brother, the other half of the trade, was gone. From that point on, Henry Hendey would carry the company essentially alone. He was not entirely without help. A young bookkeeper named Frederick William Feusenich, from a family that had emigrated from Prussia, rose to treasurer and director, managing the money while Henry managed the metal, and he stayed woven into both the company and the town for the rest of his life. Henry himself became the first warden of the borough of Torrington. These men were building the town around the factory at the same time they were building the factory itself. Here is where the story becomes something more than a survival tale, because what saved the company was not luck. It was the machines. And the company's first great product was not the lathe it would become famous for. It was the shaper. A shaper pushes a single cutting tool back and forth across a piece of metal, shaving it flat and true, stroke after stroke. In the 1870s, most shapers reversed that heavy ram with a positive clutch, a violent, clattering mechanism that slammed the stroke into reverse and beat itself to pieces over time. In 1875, Hendey began building a shaper that used a friction drive instead, based on a mechanism patented by a man named Eli Manville. Instead of a hard slam, the friction drive let the ram reverse smoothly, gentler on the machine and on the work, and machinists noticed immediately. The recognition came fast. In 1876, at the Great Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, the show that announced American industrial power to the world, Hendey displayed its shapers and a planer and came home with a diploma and a medal of superiority. Then came the Navy tests of 1878 and the decision to adopt the Hendey friction shaper as the standard for the entire fleet. The Navy did not care about your founding story. It cared whether the machine worked when the country needed it. Hendey's did. There is a story from these years that machinists still tell. An officer of the Russian army toured the machine builders of New England looking for someone to build a small lathe to an extraordinarily exacting set of specifications. One after another, the established firms turned him away. Too fussy, the tolerances too tight, not worth the trouble. He kept traveling until he reached Torrington, and Hendey took the commission and delivered the machine. In the company's own telling, that demanding little Russian lathe was the seed of the whole engine lathe business that would define the firm. Hendey had found its identity. It would be the shop that said yes to the job everyone else called impossible. The standard engine lathe entered the line around 1890 and became the heart of the company. But the moment that put Hendey in the history books came in 1892, and it belonged to a man named Wendell P. Norton. On an engine lathe, One of the core jobs is cutting screw threads, and the pitch of that thread was controlled by a set of gears on the end of the machine. If a machinist needed a different thread, he had to stop, physically remove heavy, oil-slicked cast iron change gears by hand, calculate the ratio, find the replacements, and mount them. Slow, filthy, error-prone work, and every shop feared a lost or broken change gear that could put a machine out of action. Norton, working as a designer for Hendey, built the solution. His quick-change gearbox mounted a cone of different-sized gears permanently on a single shaft inside the machine. The operator simply moved one lever with a sliding gear along a curved plate and dropped it into the position he wanted. That was it. A new thread pitch or feed rate, instantly, without removing a single gear. The standard box gave 36 different feed changes from the movement of one lever. He was granted United States Patent 470,591 on March 8, 1892, and an improvement patent for the reversing mechanism in 1894. But Norton was not the first to imagine an arrangement of gears like this. A similar concept had been patented decades earlier. What Hendey and Norton did was make it work, make it reliable, and make it in quantity. They were the first to successfully commercialize the quick-change gearbox and put it on the shop floors of the world. And the market settled the argument. Hendey exhibited the design at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1892, and again at the Paris Exposition in 1900, and won gold medals both times. Norton sold his patents to the company, took a royalty on every machine that used his design, and became superintendent of the works. The machine that resulted, the Hendey Norton lathe, became the standard the entire industry chased. The design was so influential that the phrase Norton gearbox became a generic term across the whole trade, the way people say Hoover for a vacuum. Every serious lathe builder in the world eventually had to follow. Hendey had not just built a better machine, it had redrawn the map of how lathes were made from Torrington, Connecticut. Now, how were these machines actually made? Because this is the part that separated Hendey from its competitors, and it is the part most tellings leave out. The precision came from the foundry floor and the hands of the men on the benches. In 1884, against the common practice of the day, Hendey built its own foundry. Most machine builders bought their castings from outside. Hendey poured its own because the single most important part of a precision lathe is the big cast iron bed it all sits on, and that casting decides the quality of everything built on top of it. By owning the foundry, Henry Hendey controlled the metallurgy itself, the recipe of the melt, the way it cooled, the way it aged. It began, as every casting does, in the pattern shop, the very trade Arthur Hendey had come from. A pattern maker built the wooden master of a part slightly oversized, using a shrink rule, a ruler deliberately miscalibrated because molten iron contracts as it cools. Get the shrinkage wrong, and every casting comes out the wrong size. Iron was melted in a cupola and run molten into a great ladle, and from that ladle, men poured the beds and housings by hand, a job equal parts skill and controlled danger. Then, critically, the castings were left to season. A rushed casting holds internal stresses that slowly warp it for years, which is fatal in a machine meant to hold accuracy to 0.010ths of an inch. A properly aged casting has let those stresses settle before a single cut is taken. Only then did the machining begin, the boring and planing and gear cutting, done not on some vast automated line, but on ordinary, superbly run machines operated by highly skilled men. This was a shop full of craftsmen making machines for other craftsmen. The final accuracy came from hand scraping, the secret at the heart of every truly precise machine tool, and almost a lost art now. A machinist coats a reference surface known to be flat with a thin blue dye and rubs it against the machine's surface. The dye transfers to the high spots. Then, with a scraper, he shaves those high spots away by hand, a few thousandths at a time, and checks again and scrapes again for hours. until the surface makes contact evenly across its whole face. Every flat and every sliding way on a Hendey was brought to final truth this way, by a man's eye and a man's hand. No machine can do it. It is the reason a well-built lathe from the 1920s can still hold accuracy a century later. As factories electrified around the turn of the century, the design evolved. The early machines were cone-head lathes, driven by flat leather belts over stepped pulleys from overhead line shafts. In 1905 came one of the company's signature innovations, the tie-bar headstock. On an open-top lathe, the force of a heavy cut could actually flex the two spindle-bearing housings apart, causing chatter and ruining the finish. The Hendey tie bar was a massive cast-iron link that bridged those housings right over the drive belt, tying them together and making the whole headstock immensely rigid. A simple idea, executed beautifully. Then came the motors. Around 1907, the first geared head models appeared, and by the mid-1920s, Hendey offered 8-speed and then 12-speed all-geared heads, with the motor tucked into the cast-iron leg. The plant grew in step with its town. As Torrington's population climbed from a few thousand into the tens of thousands, the works on Summer Street expanded again and again, brick buildings in the 1890s. The foundry doubled in 1899 with a modern powerhouse, a 4-story machine shop by 1910. The wooden shed had become a campus of brick and steel. Henry Hendey did not see all of it. He died in December of 1906, the founder who had built an engine by hand to start a company that now stood among the most respected in its industry. But the culture he set, that obsessive pursuit of precision, outlived him completely. When the company published a lavish volume in 1922 to mark its first half-century, it gave the book a fitting title, A Brief Record of a Charted Course. By then, the machines were going everywhere. The First World War had sent demand for machine tools to levels no one had imagined, because you cannot build an aircraft engine or an artillery shell without precision lathes to make the parts. And Hendey's global reach in this era produced the stories that still define its legend. Company records describe lathes shipped knocked down to Calcutta, railed as far as the line went, then carried the last 400 miles overland by laborers. Others crossed into South America in pieces and were hauled over the Andes strapped to mules. A lathe built in a Connecticut mill town was, by the 1920s, a genuinely global object, and in 1921, the Torrington plant reached the largest size it would ever be. And then, at the very peak of the company's prestige, came the betrayal. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, and the Depression brought out both the best and the worst in the people inside the company. The best came from management's response. As orders evaporated, the numbers were brutal. In one year, the plant built 71 lathes. The next year, 9. The year after that, 17. A works built to turn out machines by the hundreds was nearly idle. And yet, according to the people who lived through it, the company tried to keep its workers on, giving men even a few hours a week rather than cutting them loose into a town where there were no other jobs. The worst came from the top. In these same desperate years, while machinists scraped by on a handful of hours, one of the company's own senior executives was stealing from it. A vice president named S.H. Childs, prominent enough to serve as the public face introducing the company's new high-speed lathe to its dealers, was later convicted of embezzling from Hendey. Picture the betrayal from the shop floor. Men taking pay cuts and short weeks to keep the doors open, while a man in the front office quietly looted the accounts. I want to be honest with you here, because some of the more dramatic details that float around about this case, the exact figures, the arrest, the courtroom, could not be firmly confirmed in the reliable record. What is documented is the core fact, and it is damning enough. A trusted executive robbed the company during its hardest years, and it fractured whatever trust remained between the men who made the machines and the men who ran the books. That fracture would matter when the next great crisis arrived. That crisis was a war, and it revealed both how essential Hendey had become and how strained its own house had grown. When the Second World War arrived, precision machine tools became the single most strategic industrial product in the country because every weapon, every engine, every instrument that won the war had parts that were turned and shaped on accurate machines first. Hendey ran flat out, and with so many of its men drafted, the factory floor changed. Women came into the plant and ran the heavy lathes and shapers, and in 1943, the noted industrial photographer Robert Yarnall Ritchie shot a series inside the Torrington Works that stands today as some of the finest photography ever made of an American machine tool plant. In those images you can see it all: the pattern shop, the pouring of the iron, the gear cutting, and the women at the machines, building the tools that built the arsenal. But the war years were not the seamless, patriotic unity we like to imagine. Underneath the record production ran real, hard conflict. As defense contracts poured in and the plant became a pressure cooker of mandatory overtime, the workers organized and demanded their share, and the trust already damaged in the Depression showed its cracks. In the summer of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, the workforce at Hendey, organized under the United Auto Workers, threatened to walk out over wages and conditions, and a strike hit the floor that stalled defense production. It was serious enough that the federal government's newly created National Defense Mediation Board had to step in to broker peace and get the men back to their machines. And the friction did not fully resolve. Later that year, the fight came down to a matter of pennies. Workers pressing for a raise of 5 cents an hour and management holding at 4. It is easy, 80 years on, to read that as a footnote. But that 1 cent gap is the whole human story of the arsenal of democracy in a single detail. The machines that armed a nation were built by men fighting over pennies, and neither side was wrong. Hendey came through the war a vital supplier, and kept building for the military into the Cold War. It also, in these years, made some of the most beautiful machines in its history. It had a high-speed lathe that could run up to 5,000 revolutions per minute for the finest instrument work. And it built a tool room lathe, the 9-inch tool and gauge maker's lathe, as its answer to the Monarch 10EE, the most respected precision tool room lathe in America. The Hendey went head-to-head with that benchmark, with a variable speed drive, a stout spindle, and a finish that tool makers still speak about with reverence. When the Second World War ended, the government and its contractors were left holding thousands of nearly new machine tools they no longer needed, and they dumped them onto the market as surplus at a fraction of the price of a new machine. Ask the question every factory owner asked in 1946. Why buy a brand new Hendey when you could buy a lightly used 1943 Hendey, still superb, for pennies on the dollar? The company's own durability had become its competitor. At the same time, the ground shifted under the whole industry. A new cutting material, tungsten carbide, was changing the physics of machining. Carbide could cut hard steel far faster than the older tool steels. But to use it without shattering the brittle tooling, a lathe needed heavy blocky beds, high horsepower, and gearboxes that could run fast without a whisper of vibration. Hendey's machines were precise, some of the most precise ever made, but the older designs had been engineered for a gentler era of cutting. Retooling the entire product line fast enough to compete would have cost a fortune the company, bleeding cash, no longer had. And then came the final blow, which was not carbide and not surplus, but a man. In 1952, a financier bought a controlling interest in Hendey stock, promising to strengthen the company with fresh capital. He did the opposite. He sold it off in pieces, the product lines, the buildings, the land. In 1954, The Hendey lathe and shaper lines were sold to the Barber-Coleman Company of Rockford, Illinois, a firm founded in 1894, best known for gear hobbing and textile machinery, that wanted the patents, the designs, and the legendary name. Production of Hendey machines moved out of Torrington, out of Connecticut, to Illinois. The town that had been the home of Hendey for 84 years was suddenly not. Barber-Coleman kept building Hendey-designed machines for a while, then wound them down, and complete machine production of the line ended around 1962. In an Illinois factory far from the Naugatuck Valley, the last true Hendey rolled off the line. But a machine built the way Hendey built them does not simply disappear, because the machines survived, nearly all of them. Built from properly seasoned iron and finished by hand to hold accuracy for a century, Hendey lathes and shapers simply refused to die. They passed from factory to factory, from war surplus auction to small job shop to home workshop, and everywhere they went, they kept cutting true. A machine sold as scrap-priced surplus in 1946 was, in truth, a machine with 80 good years still in it. And so, decades after the company that made them was gone, the machines quietly outlasted every force that had tried to kill their maker. They outlasted the surplus glut. They outlasted carbide. They outlasted the financier who sold the company for parts. Today there is a whole subculture devoted to keeping them alive. On forums and digital archives built by antique machinery enthusiasts, people track surviving Hendeys by serial number, matching them against the company's own consignment records to date each machine and trace where it was first shipped 100 years ago. There are men who know the difference between a 1912 tie bar and a 1926 geared head at a glance, who keep the old manuals scanned and shared, who can tell you which foundry mark to look for and how to read a headstock casting. The company kept meticulous records, and because those records survived, a lathe with a number stamped on its bed can still be identified, dated, and placed. When one of these registries turns up a machine, it is not a relic behind glass. It is a working tool that someone dragged out of a shuttered factory or rescued from a scrapyard, saving 3,000 pounds of cast iron from the melting pot on the sheer conviction that a machine this good deserves to keep working. That conviction is the real inheritance Hendey left behind. And the restoration is real work, the same work that built the machines in the first place. These craftsmen re-scrape the worn ways by hand, the exact technique the Hendey benchman used, blue dye and a scraper and hours of patience, bringing a 100-year-old surface back to true. They recut broken gears. They fit modern variable frequency drives so the old machines can run on modern power, bypassing the vanished world of overhead line shafts and single-phase supply. A man in his garage today, restoring a 1920s Hendey, is quietly practicing the same trade as a Hendey machinist in 1922. He is bluing the same kind of surface, chasing the same 10,000th of an inch, feeling for the same contact under his hands. The pursuit of precision did not end when the company did. It just moved into 1,000 private workshops, one restored lathe at a time. The town remembered, too. The Torrington Historical Society built an award-winning permanent exhibit titled Pursuit of Precision, honoring the company that had defined the town's industrial life for nearly a century. Its centerpiece is a recreated 1930s machine shop with a Hendey lathe, a shaper, and a milling machine, all fully operational, all driven by a period-correct system of overhead leather belts and spinning pulleys, restored in part by the very men who had once worked at Hendey. Stand in that room and you hear what the factory sounded like, the soft slap of the belts, the whir of the pulleys, the machines turning under power a century after they were poured. The Society's archives hold the operator manuals and drawings and correspondence, the paper record of a company that mattered, kept safe against forgetting. The buildings themselves did not fare as well, and their end is its own quiet tragedy. The great plant on Summer Street, where the iron had been poured and the ways hand-scraped for 3 generations, passed through a few later industrial tenants and then stood empty, decaying year by year into a brown field of broken windows and buckled floors. The arched brick machine shops that had once run day and night became a hazard the city wanted gone. Preservationists fought to save them, arguing that this was the architectural cathedral of Torrington's industrial past, that a place where a single invention had changed the world's workshops deserved adaptive reuse rather than the wrecking ball. They pushed back against redevelopment plans that would have swept the site clean. It was a hard fight, waged with petitions and public meetings, and a real sense of what was at stake. And in the end, it was a losing one. What the demolition debate did not finish, fire did. Blazes tore through the vacant complex, the foundry gutted years before the worst of it, and much of what remained came down to rubble and ash. The place where Wendell Norton's gearbox changed the way the world cut metal is, for the most part, simply gone. One more empty lot in a New England mill town that used to make the finest lathes on earth. But here is the thing about a company like Hendey. Its real monument was never the buildings. It was the standard. Henry Hendey started with a homemade engine and an unwillingness to accept that any job was too fine to attempt, and he built that unwillingness into cast iron. Every time a machinist today drops a lever on a quick-change gearbox and cuts a perfect thread without touching a change gear, he is using the idea Hendey and Norton made real. Every time a craftsman blues a surface and scrapes it true by hand, he is doing what the Hendey benchman did. The company died 3 times over, from panic and theft and its own excellence, and the machines outlived every one of those deaths, still holding accuracy to a 10,000th of an inch, a century after the men who built them clocked out for the last time. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the best thing you can do is subscribe to Trade Archive so the next one finds you. There is another industrial empire, built and broken in ways you would not believe, waiting in the video on your screen right now. Go watch it.